Welcome to today's webinar presented by Dr. Amy Rolfson.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And I wanted to extend a thank you for everyone for coming here today to learn with us. So today I'm representing Diagnostic Solutions Lab. I work with Diagnostic Solutions as part of the medical education team or the clinical team. So when you run a test, you can feel confident that you've got someone to help you. Our goal is to help you get better results for your patients. And we've got a huge list of tests you can run. Our flagship test, the GI map, you may be familiar with. But just know that any test you run, you will have a consultation support. You just need to book that appointment and we're here to help. So today's webinar is going to be focusing on pediatric anxiety. And my goal today is to show you how you can use our functional tests to dig deeper in your anxious patients. And you can use these tests for adults with anxiety, you can use them for children with anxiety, but today we're going to focus on kids and how to get supplements into kids. So I'm not going to focus too much on the anxiety management part of it, but more how to choose which tests to run. I'm going to run a whole bunch of tests today, and it's going to be very, very clinically based, not a lot of science-based in here, but everything is backed by science, and you can be confident of that. So thank you for joining me. I might get a little bit wordy today because cases get me very excited, and I'm sure they get you excited as well. So let's talk a bit about anxiety to start, and then I'll show you the tests. We'll talk a little bit about a supplement choosing approach for kids, and then we'll dive right into our cases. Okay, so anxiety, this is the Oxford definition of anxiety, a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Now, anxiety is a very normal, healthy emotion. It is designed to help protect us from danger. What becomes a problem is when we interact in an unhealthy way with anxiety. So the goal with mild to moderate anxiety is to change our interactions with it to work in our favor. And then you get the more psychiatric definition of anxiety, which gets into describing it as a mental condition with excessive apprehension, avoidance behavior, and often leading to physical symptoms. So what I see in kids is stomach aches, headaches, vomiting, things like that. So when anxiety gets to a really troublesome point, we need to look a little bit deeper. We need more interventions. But in terms of anxiety as a simple emotion, it is part of a healthy, normal environment for children. Now, most of the kids in my practice with anxiety do get referred out for art therapy, for occupational therapy to make sure things like reflexes are all integrated and that we've got coping mechanisms, co-regulation exercises, things like that. So that's really, really helpful. There's a huge place for breathing exercises and mindfulness in these kids. Now, I want to talk to you about when in my practice I think about testing for my anxious pediatric patients. So some patients will come in with mild anxiety as part of their overall picture. And when I think about testing deeper is when the anxiety is affecting their quality of life. So affecting their daily living, such as going to school, going to after school activities, going to sleepovers, things like that. And when we've got pretty severe anxiety affecting activities, when anxiety or outbursts affect relationships. So if children are not able to regulate their anxiety or interact with their anxiety in a healthy way during activities, and it leads to outbursts and conflict and maybe not building friendships. That's a big deal, and we may want to look deeper. If anxiety comes in a rapid onset, so after a trauma, or an offshoot of that I see a lot in my practice is anxiety that comes on rapidly after an illness. And that's when I'm thinking, yes, there is likely to be a physiologic contributor, if not a physiologic cause of this anxiety. There's going to be some contributing factors that we want to look at. We want to dive into those and find the answers so we can really personalize our treatment plans to this patient and reverse that. If anxiety is accompanied by other symptoms like energy and fatigue issues, attention issues like ADHD, sleep issues, growth changes, either not growing on the same growth chart or gaining weight and not able to lose weight, and that happening rapidly, pardon me. Mood changes, and especially when accompanied by depression, I want to look deeper, and we're going to look at the physiology, and I'll explain to you a little bit about why we use each of these tests. But next slide, I'm going to talk about the tests we offer here at Diagnostic Solutions Lab that I would consider running in my children with anxiety. So the first test, this is a flagship test here at Diagnostic Solutions Lab. It's the GI map. It's a stool test looking for organisms. So this is a quantitative PCR test, so it's really, really sensitive and specific, and will bring up organisms like pathogens, like the really nasty organisms. We've got H. pylori, we've got normal flora, we've got opportunistic organisms, which only really show up when there's an imbalance already in the system. So we're looking at bacteria, parasites, yeast, and then we're looking at intestinal health, so things like inflammation, how well someone's digesting their foods, whether there is a gluten sensitivity, immune response, things like that. So we've got a lot to look at with the GI map. I absolutely love this test, and I run it in almost every single patient I see, but especially gut-brain cases, I see this test really coming into play. The next test, which is a new-ish test for Diagnostic Solutions Lab, the organic acid profile, has been recently revamped to be so much more user-friendly. So this test is amazing. It's a next-generation organic acid test with really, really relevant and well-researched markers. This tests whole body metabolism. This is an at-home first morning urine test. So for children, it's a really, really low invasive test. It's not at all invasive. So the stool test, the urine test are pretty easy to sample, whereas blood tests get a little bit more challenging in our pediatric population, especially our neurodivergent kids. It can be really hard to get those blood samples. So we can get a lot of information with the stool test, with the urine test, and the organic acids. You don't need a lot of training now to be able to use it. There are new algorithms built in that break it down on the first 1 to 3 pages, and then the last page shows us how you might want to intervene nutritionally, and that algorithm seems to be bang on from what I can see. It's really, really user-friendly. The other tests I would consider running, these are 2 tests that can be bundled together, and these are testing for antibodies, which can turn on the immune system, turn on inflammation in the body. So the IgG Food Explorer is looking for delayed onset food sensitivities. The IgE Allergy Explorer is looking for rapid onset food and environmental allergies. These can be either separate or bundled together. In children, often I'll bundle them together, especially when there's something like a suspected allergy or eczema. Things like that would trigger me to run the IgE as well, but often I will just bundle them together. So let's talk about why I would run each one of these tests. I'm going to breeze through this pretty quickly because I want to get to those cases and I'm excited about the cases. So why test GI function? So gastrointestinal is what I mean by GI. And I'll give you just a little snapshot of how GI function can affect brain function here. There's a whole webinar on this one slide. So you can go check out that webinar, and there's a lot out there on stress in the microbiome, stress in the gut environment, but basically dysbiosis, or the state of bad organisms growing in the gut, or too many moderately unpleasant organisms in the gut, can lead to gut inflammation, barrier dysfunction, and barrier dysfunction means the gut lining, or what people often refer to as leaky gut. So if you have bad bacteria in the gut, it can lead to inflammation and barrier dysfunction, and then that can lead to neural inflammation and blood-brain barrier dysfunction, and basically allows the immune system to interact with the contents of the gut lumen and be less immune tolerant. So gut organisms can also interact with your neurotransmitters. So some of our nastiest bacteria can actually use our stress hormones as growth factors. And then in turn, they can produce stress hormones, and they can interact with the conversion of things like dopamine to norepinephrine, and can increase serotonin or decrease serotonin production, which affects the entire gut environment, but also the brain physiology. So our gut organisms, when they get out of balance, can really change our brain function. Lower ability to digest and absorb our nutrients. So we take in the foods and we are trusting that our body is able to break them down and absorb them to use. If we're not able to do that efficiently, that can impact our energy, our mood, our neural processing, and our overall physiology. And then kind of turning that direction of communication around, we were talking about how the gut can impact the brain. The brain can also impact the gut. And so stress/anxiety can impact the movement of your gut, your GI motility, secretions like your stomach acid, pancreatic enzymes, bile, things like that, which will affect your digestion and absorption. Stress can actually promote GI inflammation, whereas our parasympathetic, our vagus nerve, promotes an anti-inflammatory response. Stress can increase your susceptibility to infection by lowering your immune status and will predispose to dysbiosis. It'll change the organisms that are present in the gut and the organisms that will thrive in the gut, favoring a more inflammatory skew. Now, that's why I would test the GI map. I test the GI map in almost everybody. We're going to talk about the organic acid profile here. And I use the word metabolism because the organic acid profile gives us an idea of our whole body metabolism and physiology. It's an amazing test. And I think if you are not using this yet in your practice, you should use this in almost everybody. It gives you a great baseline. The Omics uses urine and plasma. In my pediatric population, I use the organic acid profile, which is just urine, and I find that's one less barrier to getting those results, is not having that plasma blood draw. And then for some families, it's no issue to get the plasma, but it is easier just to use the urine for children. So with this test, we're looking at things like mitochondrial function. So how we're using our food sources, and specifically our sugars, and how cleanly we're burning them into energy. So if mitochondria have some blockades, you're going to have people who are seeking out fast energy sources and they're not burning cleanly from sugar into energy, to put it very basically. So we're looking at a lot of cofactors in the organic acid profile that are part of our absorptive capacity. We want to get our minerals and our proteins absorbed, as well as our sugars and our fats and all our micronutrients. But minerals and proteins can be cofactors in a lot of these reactions, and we'll have a lot of markers on this test that will show us deficiencies in these that will affect things like our neurotransmitter, our chemicals in the brain, our cellular inputs of the basic makeup of our cells, and all over body physiology. Carbohydrate imbalances are heavy on this test. So there's measurements like fructose and a lot of a lot of our blood sugar metabolism is going to be shown on this test, and that can impact energy, mood, and a lot of other functions. I'm going to breeze past here. So we're looking at metabolites of stress hormones and neurotransmitters. We're also looking for cortisol on this test. Fatty acid metabolism is highlighted on this test, which will show how cleanly you're burning your fats, how well you're beta oxidizing your fats. We'll measure toxic and liver metabolites. So just a ton of things. This doesn't even cover half of what this test is looking for. And then there's a section on microbial markers, which kind of pulls you back to GI map. So I love running these two tests together. And then by the time you get the OAP back, it will heavily feature microbial metabolites when you have a heavier GI map. I see them correlating really, really well. Okay, looking at antibodies. Now, IgG food sensitivity testing is really, really common in the functional field. It gets a lot of criticism and a lot of people are still using it. I use it in my patients if I think it'll improve compliance. Often you can have people just eliminate some commonly antigenic foods, and I see this making a huge difference in their ability to re-regulate the gut and get everything back in balance if you take out the foods and environmental factors sometimes that are causing a dysfunctional immune response. So what we're looking at here with the IgE Allergy Explorer is an immediate allergic reaction. So this will be turning on immune cells, leading to sometimes more IgE production, sometimes histamine production, a very inflammatory, rapid response. It doesn't always look like anaphylaxis, although sometimes it does. Sometimes you'll see kind of rapid-ish onset skin symptoms, or, just inflammatory reactions that come on pretty quickly after foods. And so that's what would make me think about IgE responses. And then sometimes you'll see the environmental stuff come up, like dust mites, pets, grasses, things like that. So this tests everything. In the context of these cases, we're going to be talking more about foods. IgG is our delayed hypersensitivity responses. And I do see clinical value in measuring these, especially if it increases compliance. So I do see the same foods come up over and over and over. And what I hear practitioners saying for this test is, yeah, but it just shows you what foods you're eating and how your immune system is reacting to them in the moment. And my response is, yes, it does. This is the whole point of the test. It's a great test and it is dynamic. So over time, you will see this test changing. So what we will see is what foods you're taking into your body and what dysfunctional immune responses are happening in response to that food. So that is really, really valuable to see, and it can really increase patient compliance to see that test on paper. They've got a list of foods to minimize or avoid, and even minimizing can help. So what I see with parents often is we'll come back with a list of foods, and often the top ones are dairy, eggs, and gluten, or dairy and eggs, or gluten and eggs, something like that. And they'll say, wait, but that's 80% of my child's diet. And I say, okay, yeah, that's really hard. And acknowledging that that's hard is really important. But seeing that somebody has 80% input of something that's causing a dysfunctional immune response, that's also a huge opportunity to minimize that immune burden. So reducing those foods, potentially replacing them with less antigenic foods, maybe a whole food plant forward diet, higher in fiber. But let's be real, we're talking about pediatrics here, but some kids will be able to do that. Some kids will struggle with that. But I do find a lot of value in this test. So food reactions, either IgE or IgG, the net response is inflammation, which leads to barrier dysfunction or leaky gut, loss of immune tolerance, which means building food sensitivities. So maybe you start with 1, and then you end up with 2 sensitivities and 5 sensitivities, and then someone's got a really limited diet. And then the inflammation and the food sensitivities themselves and the poorly broken down antigenic proteins can lead to an altered and more inflammatory microbiota. So a lot of imbalances can come from food sensitivities and food allergies, and I do find a lot of clinical value in pulling those out. And when we're working with a pediatric population, we have got some people here that respond so readily to basic interventions. So taking out foods, often you'll see response in kids within 2 weeks. So a lot more responsive than adults when it comes to food eliminations. Okay, so I put this slide in here just to geek out a little bit. This is more back to the metabolism, but looking at these categories here, like neurotransmitters, bile acids, tryptophan metabolites, vitamins, short chain fatty acids, carnitine and choline metabolites, and how they impact brain function. And I'm going to move away from the slide pretty quickly, but you can come back to this. There's the paper that it's from in bottom right corner. I absolutely love this image, and it just shows you how impactful our metabolism can be on our brain function. Let's talk a bit about treatment in kids. This can be really, really hard. And I do a lot of our pediatric consultations here with Diagnostic Solutions Lab, and I get a lot of questions about, okay, how do I get that into a child? How do I get that into this particular child? So what we want to think about for our pediatric patients when we're trying to get nutrients into them. So we've got all these tests. It comes back with the need for, say, B vitamins and choline, and maybe you need an antimicrobial. How the heck do we get that into our pediatric patients' mouths, down their throats? And beyond that, how do we get that into them maybe twice daily for 2 months? How do we get that into them for 10 days? It can be really, really challenging. And so flavor and texture are super important. I see a lot of people compromising flavor and texture in favor of nutritional value. And I do see that that's important. We want to get really high quality nutrients into our children, but the name of the game is consistency. We want things that can get into them consistently daily. So finding that balance between flavor, texture, and nutrient density in those supplements, it can be a really big challenge. So I spend most of my career hunting out the tastiest supplements, and it's hard. Some things like B vitamins and mitochondrial support don't lend themselves that well to being delicious. So it can be really, really tricky. We want to be thinking about how frequently we need to dose. The more frequently we dose it, the less resistance we want to have from the children we're working with, because we don't want to ruin anyone's lives. We may already be taking out some of their favorite foods. Adding in a supplement that is going to be a fight 3 times a day is not acceptable. So we need things that taste good. We need to sneak them in. And then some of your pediatric patients will be highly compliant, and they will be able to intellectualize and take the supplements happily. And most won't. Another consideration here is how many households are we dealing with? A lot of our pediatric patients come from separated households, so either divorce or separation, where you do need to make your protocols really simple and portable, so they can take it maybe to school with them and have another parent pick them up at the end of the day and continue with that protocol, making sure everybody's on board. And when it comes to lab testing, it's also really important to check your state or provincial regulations around separation and consent, especially when it comes to blood draws. Patient personality and compliance. So there's an age continuum here, and then there's a personality continuum. So I find between the age of 7, 8, and maybe 10, 11, you've got a big renaissance of that ability to see inputs and see how they make you feel, and actually reflect back on, okay, when I eat this food, I don't feel great. When I take this supplement every day, I feel pretty good. And so as children move into that tween and then into the teen age, sometimes they become my most compliant patients because they can actually recognize that in themselves that, hey, when I take my magnesium every day and I don't eat dairy, my mood is better. I just feel, I have less yellow-red regulation zones, and I'm able to get through my day and feel really, really good. And when I eat them or when I don't take my supplements, I feel really bad. Some kids will benefit from being on supplements longer term, like B vitamins, magnesium. That can be a longer term recommendation. And then you get your kids that are really cheeky, really smart, and are loving the good flavors. They want all the good flavors. And then even if you give them the tastiest gummies and they get the thumbs up test, day 2, you put them in front of them and they fold their arms across their chest and say, yeah, I'd rather not, and then walk out the door. So it's tricky. It can be hard for kids to be compliant, and we have to honor that and appreciate it. And it's fun, and it's a fun challenge to work around, finding all the flavor texture balances. So think about all these things when you're dosing. There's going to be liquids, teas, tinctures. I would prefer glycerites to tinctures usually for children, chewables, powders. In terms of dosing for children, it's really, really simple, especially when we're working with our natural therapeutics that usually have a fairly wide therapeutic window. And a wide therapeutic window means that even if you get a little wiggle room in the dosing, if you dose a tiny bit too high or a tiny bit too low, it's not going to be a problem. It's going to be safe. It's going to be effective. The narrower a therapeutic window, the more danger you have with dosing it wrong. So our supplements usually have an extremely wide therapeutic window, which allows us to use things like Clark's rule really well. So this has been in use for a long time. It's really, really simple. Basically, you're taking the child's weight in pounds, divide by 150 pounds, that's your pharmacologic adult, multiplied by the adult dose. An example of this, we're gonna make this really simple for math. We've got a 50-pound 6-year-old child, and we wanna dose glycine. So glycine has, in adults, a therapeutic range of about 2 to 5 grams. So let's say 3 grams because math. And I like easy things. So 50 pounds divided by 150 pounds. Now that 150 pounds, that's our pharmacologic adult. Just a reminder, has nothing to do with this child. Multiplied by the 3-gram glycine dose gives you 1/3. 50 over 150 is 1/3 times 3 grams, which would give you 1 gram daily of glycine for a 6-year-old. So I generally dose 0.5 gram to 1 gram of glycine. You could go a little bit over and you would still be correct. So that's how I dose for children most of the time. And then some products will have pediatric dosing guides that go along with them. So let's talk cases. We're not even halfway through the webinar, so I think we're making good time. I've got a lot of data points to go over with you. So some of these lab tests I'm going to breeze through. Some of them I haven't shown all the pages. I've just showed where there's pertinent results because I'm sparing you the normal results. But I want you to see a lot of our tests and how you can use them successfully in your practice to help your patients. So these 2 siblings came into my office in back-to-back appointments. They were adorable. Brother was 8, sister was 11, and they could not have been more different in terms of personality, in terms of clinical presentation, but both had a different flavor of anxiety that in my mind and in their parents' mind went beyond mild anxiety. So starting with the sister, because I think her case is a little bit more clear-cut than the brother, and I'll show you why. So this is an 11-year-old who presented with severe upper abdominal pain. This was affecting daily life in terms of going to school, in terms of food choices. So she came into the office actually asking if she could maybe go gluten-free, dairy-free. What do I think about that? Just the sweetest, very, very sensitive, very highly feeling her whole life, and is just presenting with this pain that was actually at the point of entering my office, she was having to sleep sitting up because of the pain. Social anxiety was going on, especially around school, but also after school activities. Things like sleepovers were being affected by this anxiety that wasn't necessarily separation anxiety, but it was somewhere in that vicinity, but really, really nervous about going into these social situations. Now, what triggered me to want to run a bunch of tests in this person was that both of these, the severe upper abdominal pain and the social anxiety, came on suddenly after a GI infection just before Christmas. And actually, in my practice this year, I see a lot of children, and I've seen a lot of this presentation is about our 8 or 9 to 12-year-olds after a gut bug this winter were presenting with chronic stomach pain and chronic social anxiety. And not just generalized anxiety, but social anxiety. So I kept seeing this over and over. And it makes you really curious when you see things over and over again. But here we want to run a bunch of tests. So if I could run just one test in this patient, because we've got this onset after a gut infection, upper abdominal pain, GI map would be the one test I would run. I would love to run all 4. If I could run 2 tests, it would be GI map and organic acid panel. And then I would also request dairy, egg, gluten elimination. So if you run the food sensitivity test, you can fine tune your foods that you find to have immune responses. Whereas if people want to just go by my common antigens that I see affecting kids in practice, yeah, taking out dairy, gluten, eggs, and sometimes minimizing nuts it's pretty heavy hitting. But compliance is important, especially when there are 2 households. You want to have that piece of paper to say, hey, look, we actually need to avoid these foods for a little bit, and that can allow the gut to get back on track. So the first test that came in was the IgG food sensitivity test. Now this is page 1. We've got a summary of the entire test. What we see here is 4 categories where we've got a more severe response. And what this tells us is that in that section that's broken down over the next few pages, it's a multi-page report with milk and eggs as a whole category. There's going to be at least 1 food with a red response. Yellow is moderate, green is mild. And so in our pediatric patients, we're picking our battles. We're generally ignoring the yellows unless they're part of an overarching pattern. Like here we see dairy. There's some yellows, there's some reds. This is a pretty big dairy response, especially considering this patient had self-selected to be dairy-free about a month before coming in. And so this is somebody that's not eating dairy, maybe a little bit of Parmesan cheese every once in a while, and this is still a pretty big immune response. Now, IgG antibodies can persist a bit in the blood. Generally, you expect them to come down gradually over about 6 months, but looking at this makes me think, okay, yeah, taking out dairy is very rational here. And then we see this really big response to eggs. And this is a patient that doesn't like eggs, doesn't like the way they feel in her mouth, doesn't like the way she feels after. She just kind of thinks, no, eggs aren't for me. And that we see in kids all the time, this intuitive aversion to foods that they're sensitive to. And on the flip side, often we will see kids really drawn to and craving the foods they're sensitive to. So both ends of the spectrum can be true. But when kids say they don't like a food, pay attention, because sometimes it is a textural issue, sometimes it's a nutrient deficiency issue, and sometimes it's a true sensitivity. So anything over 40 micrograms per mil is a really big response on this test. So yeah, big egg response. She was not eating many eggs either. Next, we see some grains popping up, a lot of reaction to the gluten grains. Now, this is somebody with a family history of celiac disease, and she has been tested and has been shown to be negative for celiac disease. So this is a non-celiac gluten sensitivity. If she hadn't been tested for celiac, this would be the point at which I would run that blood test. Often in anxiety, I'm also running things like thyroid, ferritin, just a CBC. I'm not usually running a CRP standard for kids, but those tests I would often also run. And we also see corn, which is a challenging one if you're asking somebody to go gluten-free. So what I do here is I pick my battles. I would say dairy, egg, and gluten-free, which is a lot. That's a big ask. And it's also a big gift to see these foods that react. Anytime I see a positive finding on a test, I think, fantastic. This is an opportunity to feel much better if you are up for the challenge, if you can take on the challenge. And it is a challenge. But then corn, when you're substituting out gluten, especially in the world of children's foods, which don't have to be different from adult foods, but somehow they are, corn often picks up the slack from gluten. So you'll find a lot of our packaged gluten-free products will have cornstarch in them. So what we're doing here is I would minimize things or eliminate things like corn chips, popcorn, corn tortillas, obvious sources of corn, and trying to choose less packaged foods, more whole foods. And I do recognize that that's hard with making lunches. Sometimes we just need our easy things. And so prioritize the gluten over the corn. Even though this is a decent response, minimizing corn will be impactful. If you're out and you find a gluten-free muffin that's egg-free and has a little bit of corn, that's fine. It's okay. Now we see pineapple as a big reaction. I see it as a really easy thing to take pineapple out of the diet for most people, so that's not a problem. And now we look at the IgE test. So that was the IgG food sensitivity test. Here we're looking at true allergies, and this is the summary page. Now this is a really long report. If you look at the whole thing, I'm not showing you the whole report. What we see here, these 4 gray boxes, these are no response. So this is a negative test for any of the analytes tested. And what I'm always telling our clients when I'm consulting is make sure you always scroll to the last page to look at total IgE. So it measures total IgE circulating in the blood, even when everything is negative. Rarely, but sometimes, and in this case, yes, you can get a high total IgE response, and then you're left with the mystery of what is causing that? Why is there an IgE response when this very comprehensive test is negative for anything? And luckily, the next day or 2 days later, we got GI map back, and it had an answer of why IgE could be positive, because IgE can be put out in response to parasites. And here we see page 1 of GI map. This is a child with a pretty big population of Giardia. So this will drive up IgE. It is anti-parasitic, that antibody, and clearly IgE is present and not clearing Giardia, because here it is. This is very consistent with abdominal pain, with issues digesting foods, with inflammation in the gut, with food sensitivities and increasing food sensitivity. So I see this as highly abnormal, and I want this out of her system as quickly as possible. And my decision to treat things, and I've got another slide on this, is really dependent on how clinically symptomatic our patients are. So next page, we see H. pylori, which is high, also very consistent with upper GI pain, and to me, less urgent than the Giardia. Even though this is likely to be somewhat contributing to her symptoms, I think the Giardia is more impactful and more of a priority, at least in the first round of treatment. But yes, I would come back and treat this H. pylori eventually. We look at the commensal keystone species, which are the normal bacteria we want to see present. This is page 2 of GI map, and we want to see enough of these. So having low commensals is a huge risk factor in picking up a pathogen, and having good healthy levels of commensals will speed up our recovery. It'll help us clear organisms. It'll help immune tolerance, and this looks really, really good. So happy to see the commensal organisms looking great and healthy here. We've got a few opportunistic organisms here. Staph and strep are pretty basic. They show up for a lot of people, especially when they're not digesting well. And when people are stressed, they're not digesting well. In addition to that, Giardia tends to predispose to a little bit of bacterial dysbiosis by changing your ability to absorb. Giardia is frequently a small intestine organism, and it can affect our absorptive capacity and skew towards inflammation. Now, I've skipped over the yeast section. There are no other parasites. On page 4, we measure more parasites, but going straight to the intestinal health markers. And we can see really, really clearly and glaringly here that this is somebody with extremely high zonulin. Zonulin is a marker for intestinal hyperpermeability or leaky gut, and this is through the roof. This is also really, really consistent with a Giardia infection. So I think clear out the Giardia, clean up the gut, and when I see a leaky gut, often I am extrapolating that to a leaky blood-brain barrier, and we'll see anxiety very, very frequently with our people with barrier dysfunction. Just really giving the immune system an opportunity to interface with the contents of our gut, like the foods that may not be properly broken down. This would lead to a lot of food sensitivities, which we're seeing in this patient. Now that is out of range. Now we have some subclinical findings here, like a little bit of fat in the stool. So steatocrit is a measure of fecal fat. This is also very consistent with Giardia. We see low secretory IgA. These are antibodies that would recognize, engulf, and eliminate, calling in the immune system to get our abnormal organisms out. Anything non-self, non-normal. So we want to boost up this immune function, the superficial immune function, in the longer run when we get to some gut repair phases and get to kind of tidying up the gut, removing the inflammatory food sensitivities, things like that. This may come back and is very, very likely to come back. In children, we want to have a nice, healthy secretory IgA. We see anti-gliadin IgA kind of neither here nor there, but on the food sensitivity test, we saw it really, really high. So that rules in gluten sensitivity This marker is a local IgA response to gluten, and it neither rules it in or out. And then we see the fecal gluten peptide. So these bottom two markers, the gluten peptide and the zonulin, are add-on markers for GI map. I tend to add this marker on just for my strictly gluten-free patients. And this can tell you whether in the last few days there's been a gluten exposure. And here we see for this child who was eating gluten, happily or unhappily eating gluten, there it is in the stool in a really high level. So this is not showing sensitivity, but it's showing the presence of gluten in the stool. Now looking at organic acid profile. So again, this is the urine test. It was run on the same day as GI map, same day as the food sensitivity test. Sometimes you'll see an organic acid profile where you think, okay, there are some independent markers here that I think are affecting this person on a metabolic physiologic level. And I look at a test like this and I see low-grade dysfunction that is likely secondary to what we saw on the GI panel. So we see some markers for energy and mitochondria that can be related to inflammation. Oops. We see a little bit of, nutrient factors. Maybe we need some B vitamins. We probably need some antioxidants. We need to decrease inflammation. And a little bit going on with stress and mood with serotonin balance, which can be highly gut focused as well. So when I look at this test, this is page 2 of the summary, and you'll see here, we're not going to go through the whole organic acid profile. This is a multi-page report, but they've summarized it so beautifully here with what's borderline high, what's low, what's high. And we see here that there's a bit of microbial metabolites. Yes, there are microbes. Really, this organic acid profile to me looks like most of the findings are low grade and secondary to what we see on GI map. So really, GI map and Giardia is where I think this case centers at this point. And then we can clear out the Giardia, work on the H. pylori a little bit more gradually, and see how things go. Now, last page of organic acid profile, here's where we have the algorithm that finds what's almost out of balance and what's out of balance and spits out these recommendations, which are spot on. From what I interpreted when I looked at the organic acid profile, I thought, okay, yeah, maybe some B vitamins, some antioxidants, glycine, and work on the gut. And this is what came out here. So really spot on, really user-friendly. I do still recommend consulting with our team. Our team is really helpful. We're all here to help you get better results for your patients. So that's the tests that we ran. There were 4, 3 of which had a lot of results, 1 of which just had the high IgE. And now let's talk about the most relevant findings. So when you have this many data points, you need to break down what's the most important, and then you work on your priorities. So most relevant findings, according to me, would be the Giardia and the high IgE, which is in response to the Giardia. We've got H. pylori, we've got multiple food sensitivities, high zonulin indicating barrier dysfunction, low secretory IgA, so wanting to work on immunity, and then just moderate dysfunction in the organic acid profile. In terms of priorities, take out the trigger foods. This will decrease overall inflammatory and immune burden, which can make a huge difference. Giardia treatment, and we'll talk about this on the next slide. Immune support, and then we retest GI map 4 weeks after treatment. So this would be a quick Giardia treatment coming back around. If a patient were less symptomatic and had maybe lower level Giardia as an incidental finding, maybe we would do a slower, more botanical based treatment. And then after that GI map comes back, we'll reassess goals and protocol. So when a pathogen comes up on a test, I always retest. I can retest, and you as well can retest just the pathogen panel, which gets you page 1 and H. pylori, as well as the resistance genes and the virulence factors for H. pylori, or you can rerun the whole test. Now, in this case, I reran the whole test because I wanted to see everything. Here's my treatment continuum when it comes to things like parasites or pathogens and children. So we've got our lower force interventions here on the left, where they are gentle, less likely to affect the microbiome. They taste really pretty decent. There are some really tasty antiparasitic glycerites out there. Say there's one that tastes like peach and some chewables, things like that. And they're less likely to be effective. And then we move towards the right, where we're getting a bit more invasive. We might take more of a hit to the microbiome, The taste is questionable, and that is generous. The taste is likely going to be terrible and more likely to be effective. So when we're looking at treating people that cannot take pills, some children can, some can't, some can swallow small pills, some can swallow pills but prefer not to. We're looking in the world of liquids, suspensions, things like that. And so the more symptomatic a patient is, the farther to the right I will move them, the more urgent the symptoms are, because you're looking at the potential, say you choose a pharmaceutical, the potential of taking the microbiome down a notch compared with the potential of still having a parasite. And in this case, I'm putting this patient higher up on the spectrum. These are pretty severe symptoms, really affecting daily living, really sudden onset, huge population of Giardia, and I would be using a prescription. Now, the first thing we tried here was, first line for Giardia is metronidazole, which I have mixed feelings about in children, and we did a suspension of that in banana flavor, and that was beyond questionable flavor profile. That was not manageable. So we still wanted to go the prescription route to really just get that gone. So first starting protocol, we took out dairy, gluten, eggs. We chose nitazoxanide, which is a bit of a gentler antiparasitic. This is a prescription that's available fairly commonly. It's still up there for Giardia treatment, although in my practice I see a little bit less success than with metronidazole. It is fairly flavorless, dissolves in water, and so for children it's a lot more dosable. This also can be compounded in tiny little capsules, and so this patient actually chewed the capsules. So a 10-day course of nitazoxanide was what we chose. We used probiotic Saccharomyces, just a basic children's lacto-bifido chewable. Saccharomyces has a bit of a flavor, it's a little bit yeasty, and so that's a little trickier to get in there, but this was and still is a very highly compliant patient that will take pretty much everything, will remind her parents to take, that she needs to take her supplements. It's very, very cute. So colostrum, I usually get this in a powder or in capsules. You can open up the capsules. It's almost flavorless. It's a little bit creamy. Even people with dairy sensitivity seem to do pretty well with colostrum most of the time. And then people with true dairy allergies, maybe you want to go into the world of the bovine serum immunoglobulins. But for children, colostrum is usually well tolerated. And in this case, and her brother's case, I used colostrum in both. It can mix into things beautifully and is a great way to boost superficial immunity. We used fish oil for anti-inflammatory response and overall brain function. And we use an emulsified fish oil that's really, really tasty. Some children also like popping fish oil capsules in their mouth. And that I've not met many adults that like doing that, but children surprisingly don't mind chewing fish oil capsules. And pro tip is make sure the child has their mouth closed when they chew that capsule, because you don't want to find out what happens if they have their mouth open. B-complex is needed in this case, and B-complex is very challenging to find in a palatable, child-friendly flavor. There are a few gummies out there. I'm always on the look for different flavors of B-complex, but we ended up using a sugar-free gummy B-complex that's not bad, not the favorite. Vitamin C chewable, super easy, and liquids are really easy. Glycine is very easy to dose. This is just a not flavorless, but a sugary powder. And this is really calming to the nervous system, really calming and helpful for liver detox, and a cofactor in a lot of our physiologic functions. And then we went into breathing, some mindfulness, mindset, and some visceral adjustments. So in my practice, and you can refer out for this is just hands-on physical adjustments to get the GI tract just functioning optimally, making sure nothing's kind of stuck in position. And it's like a fancy belly rub. So referring out for visceral adjustments, if you have a GI pediatric based practice, is really, really helpful, or learn to do them yourself. They're amazing. And so that's how we started out. And we did that protocol for 10 days. We waited about 4 to 5 weeks to retest. At the end of the 10 days, there were still belly aches, there was still anxiety, which kind of dissipated over the next 4 weeks. At 6 weeks to check on symptoms, abdominal pain was still happening daily, but it was mild and it wasn't keeping her up at night. Anxiety was still present, but less severe. And then we got a retest back. And what we retested was just the GI map, but the whole GI map. And I'm going to show you, not the whole test, but what we can compare for test 1 to test 2. So you'll see the columns here. Giardia was still present. It was much lower, maybe at a level where it's causing less physical damage in the small intestine, but I would still address this, and I would still address this fairly persistently because this is a really resistant Giardia. If it's not treatable with nitazoxanide, it's, we level up here. H. pylori is still present, and this wasn't really the target of treatment the first time around, so we're not surprised. And then sometimes in children, when you treat with anything, even immune support, sometimes the H. pylori fades into the background. It's not always my biggest target for treatment for children, and it can be protective against things like allergies, eczema, asthma. So I don't always treat it even when it's mildly out of range. This person is upper GI symptomatic, and so yes, eventually, and this is the eventually, so round 2. Citrobacter popped up, so that is a gram-negative opportunistic bacterium that can be pretty inflammatory. Steatocrit is gone. Elastase has gone lower, so that's our pancreatic enzyme function. Secretory IgA is still low. Antigliadin, it looks like gluten elimination is going really well. And gluten peptide has gone a lot lower as well. Zonulin is much, much better. So showing that overall, things are still in flux. We need to continue treatment. Now I'm gonna go a little faster because I want to talk about our brother within the time we have left. Like I said, I get pretty chatty and excited about cases. So round 2 protocol, we're continuing switching to paramomycin for 10 days. This is a lot of antiparasitics. Introducing Lactobacillus reuteri, mastic gum, a chewable broad spectrum antimicrobial that is actually kind of palatable. It's pretty good. And then chamomile and dill tea, which can be anti-Giardia. So that's her. That's where we are right now. We're gonna do that for 10 days retest, but we're still moving along. And within the time before the webinar, we didn't have time for a third test. So we're gonna work on that, but she's feeling a lot better. Just still need to get that Giardia out because that can be really persistent. Okay, so case 2, I'm gonna whip through some of these results because some are highly relevant, some are not, but it's the organic acid panel on this one that's really fun to look at. So we've got an 8-year-old here, struggling for years with anxiety and overwhelm, just really, really easy to frustration, lots of outbursts, the sweetest kid, super smart, super funny, but really not tolerant of frustrations and anxiety and overwhelm. Doing really well at school though. So you talk to the teachers and they say, oh no, he's a model citizen, he works hard, he's quiet, he's attentive, he does everything properly, and then goes home and after masking and after regulating all day long, that's a lot, and lets it out at home, which is, if you see this in practice and if you see this in your personal life, that's a compliment to you and how safe your child feels at home. It also shows that, yes, he can be kind and speak respectfully to people in some contexts. If there's bad language at home but not at school, excellent. These are all compliments, and it's wonderful for our children to feel safe in their home and to know that they can be at their most bombastic behavior and still be loved. So that's a testament to a happy home. Believe it or not, he gets frequent illnesses all his life, more upper respiratory infections than his sister, more gut infections, pretty much picks anything up that's going around. Very sensitive to sensory things, a very discerning eater. So here's somebody where we need to be really sneaky with our supplements. So in terms of the IgG foods, I'm going to whip through this because it's really similar to his sister, but just a little bit amplified at every level. So a bit more of an immune response. So we've got our dairy response, really, really big, egg response. And this is someone that looked at this, super smart kid, 8 years old, looks at this and says, yeah, I understand, but I'm still going to eat eggs. The end, just dismissed. And from what I understand, he's being very compliant now, but just cheeky. There's a gluten response. We see some other grains popping here as well. Some seeds, some nuts, some legumes. So a lot of foods showing up here as sensitivities. And this is a huge opportunity to bring down immunity. We're not necessarily avoiding all these foods. What I would say here is we take out dairy, eggs, gluten, we minimize nuts. We pick our battles, and that will reduce a lot of the volume of antigenic foods. Now, GI map, this is a stool test. This is page 1, the pathogens. It is not typical to see 2 siblings coming in, both having a distinctly different pathogen present. Kids can pick up pathogens. They experience, especially at younger ages, experience the world with their hands and with their mouths, and they can pick up pathogens. They come and they go. And then when someone is more symptomatic, I look a little bit closer at it. So what I can say that is complementary to this family is good job not sharing your pathogens. She's got Giardia, not sharing it with him. He's got C. diff, not sharing it with her. So good job washing your hands, sort of. These are all very frequently fecal oral pathogens. So that is a positive. If you want to put an extra positive spin on things, you can high five them for not sharing with each other, sharing other things. So C. diff here, what we're measuring with GI map, since we're using quantitative PCR, we're picking up the DNA targets of these two toxins. So what we're measuring is the genes that can produce the toxins, which shows us the presence of the organism. We're not measuring whether or not these toxins are being expressed. So at any level of growth, a bacterium or other organism will turn on their virulence. They'll say, okay, there's enough of us. We will now start producing toxin A and toxin B. And in my experience in GI map, that starts around the E6, E7 level, so much higher than this. So we see here at the E4 level, the tens of thousands. This is more of a moderate C. diff population where I wouldn't expect to see massive diarrhea, infection, and big symptoms, but what I do see is anxiety. I see sometimes constipation or loose stools, gas and bloating, none of which this child had. He didn't really have gut symptoms beyond kind of picking up gut infections more frequently. So we've got C. diff present, which can be affecting mood. It can affect your dopamine and serotonin metabolism. It can cause or lead to GI inflammation. So this is an abnormal finding that I want to see gone, and it's not likely at this point to become a clinical infection, but this is going to be contributing negatively to colon health and inflammation and overall gut balance. Now, normal flora, again, look really, really good. Skipping through that, there were no significant opportunistic or parasitic or fungal growth shown on this test. And then here's the intestinal health section where, again, we see too low secretory IgA for the pathogen that we're encountering. And then we see this big immune response showing that multiple subcategories of white blood cell are circulating in the gut. So our eosinophils, and then calprotectin generally represents neutrophil infiltration in the gut. So there's a big immune response, big inflammation here, which can translate to neural inflammation, to brain inflammation. We've got some kind of subclinical findings here, beta-glucuronidase showing that there's a bit of a liver process going on potentially, and then the gluten peptide showing that gluten is present in the diet. So organic acid profile, I'm going to go through this rapidly as I can, also respecting that this test is showing a lot. So what we see in our kids with frustration intolerance, with difficulty regulating, kind of our borderline neurodivergent kids, is we see a lot of mitochondrial dysfunction. Sometimes it can be secondary to things like gut dysbiosis, and sometimes it is more genetic, environmental, and often we'll also see a huge need for nutrients and a great difficulty of getting high quality nutrients in because of potential sensory issues, a very limited diet. So this is a child whose favorite food is beige. It's just beige everything, sugar, carbs, things like that. And so it can be really tricky to translate that into a plant forward, higher fiber, high polyphenol diet. So you need to break that cycle where you can. And sometimes if you get nutrient status up to a certain degree, things like carnitine, iron, B vitamins, those sensory sensitivities can decrease a little bit. Overall overwhelm can decrease a little bit, and the diet might open up a little bit. It can be really, really tricky. So here we see a big mitochondrial blockade here where energy is not being burned cleanly. And this is somebody that's seeking out fast energy sources. So we're looking at fats not burning cleanly, sugars not burning cleanly, lots of signs here that can rise in response to inflammation, increased glucose intake. So what we see here is a mitochondrial blockade, fatty acid breakdown issues, and that can also reflect back on liver. And what I would say overall of this organic acid profile and this summary is, all I'm going to show you is the summary here. The whole test you can look through for a long time if you want, but the summary is so good here, is that the findings on this test do not seem to be dependent on the GI map findings, whereas his sister, the GI map was the big story, and the OAP showed, oh yeah, there's probably some gut dysfunction and some inflammation. But this test is standing on its own as some borderline dysfunction that if we can correct it, if we can correct some of the nutrient imbalances and inflammation, a lot of these would change, and we would see different overall body physiology, energy processing, neurotransmitter processing. So under nutrition, everything's popping up B vitamins. We need a B complex. We need B12. We need biotin. And then we see these other markers that can be fungal markers. Oh, that one shows up for dysbiosis. And also the intake of processed foods and beverages. This is somebody who just craves and sneaks sugar all the time. He's deep in the Halloween candy. As soon as November 1st hits, it's gone. So this is somebody I do believe was taking in a lot of sugar. And that can also lead to mitochondrial issues, but mitochondrial issues can lead to sugar intake issues. So like I said before, your C. diff difficile organism can affect your dopamine and serotonin turnover. And so we see some dopamine turnover issues and some serotonin turnover where we're running a little bit high in those neurotransmitters. This is somebody with a very spicy temper and a difficulty regulating mood some of the time. Some of this may be attributable to that C. diff, and some of it may be intrinsic as part of genetic makeup or environmental nutrient deficiencies, things like that. What I see here that is even more concerning, though, is this quinolinic acid, which is a marker for neural inflammation. This is something that often I'll use magnesium glycinate to help work against, but this is in response to inflammation, potential neurotransmitter imbalance, and then we'll see things like B vitamin deficiencies, you need fish oils, magnesium, polyphenols, all these things to try to bring this down, but this can contribute a lot to neural inflammation. And the symptoms and clinical picture this boy was presenting with were very neuroinflammatory. Now, picolinic acid was also high, which can be protective against quinolinic acid. So this is showing up saying, hey, there's too much quinolinic acid, let's protect against it. So we're seeing this imbalance that is showing neurotransmitters are a little bit off, inflammation potentially in the brain. Sometimes quinolinic acid can show up in response to infections, same with picolinic acid. We also see a little bit of evidence that there could be some toxic burden going on. Liver is working really, really hard here. And then on the last page, this microbial metabolite page is huge. And so what we see here is some potential fungal markers where on GI-MAP we did not see yeast. Now this is a urine test reflecting whole body metabolism. GI-MAP is looking at stool. So if there is yeast in the stool and it's one of the fungi tested on GI-MAP, it picks them up really, really sensitively. But there can be other areas of the body where there can be fungal issues. So this is somebody that I think, yeah, there's some fungal input here. We see C. diff, we see fungi, and a lot of markers for the microbes here. So this again reflects back on GI-MAP, but also whole body metabolism. Now here's his last page of the test where we've got the algorithm that puts out nutrient recommendations. And again, bang on. We've got our B complex, including, especially the thiamine, biotin, B12, magnesium there. I would choose glycinate. Now, citrate comes in gummies really frequently. Glycinate, I found a couple of really good liquids that have glycinate, but not a lot of gummies. Would love to find some good magnesium glycinate and threonine sources. Did I say that right? Don't remember. CoQ10, I would choose an overall mitochondrial support here. And then a huge need for antioxidants, glycine again, and then pointing back to dysbiosis. So when I break down the whole case with most relevant findings, we're going to have the C. diff and dysbiosis, maybe fungal, GI and neural inflammation, mitochondria, nutrient status, gut immunity, and food sensitivities. So there's a lot here to work on. And seeing a lot to work on, it's easy to get overwhelmed, but it's also a huge positive that there are a lot of things here where we can bring down overall immune activity, inflammation, and help a patient feel a lot better. So the starting protocol here was fun. It's always fun to come up with challenges of how to get things tasty into our more discerning pediatric patients. So we're taking out as much as we can, dairy, eggs, and gluten, minimizing nuts. Same probiotics as sister, Saccharomyces, which has a flavor. It was instantly rejected, so that's a tough one, but that's really protective against C. diff. Lactone bifido probiotic. We've got the colostrum, which was taken just fine. It's really easy to get into things, mixed in smoothies. Butyrate I'm using here. Even though butyrate producers are normal, I love butyrate as a gut anti-inflammatory. It's also protective against C. diff colitis. So kind of keeping that C. diff as a population versus an infection. And what I also love about butyrate is that it crosses the blood-brain barrier, stimulates BDNF production and new neuronal signals or neuronal pathways. So this is really anti-inflammatory in the gut and in the brain and has a huge place here. You can get it in a liquid that tastes just fine. It's not a texture that most kids love, but you can get that down once a day. You can get that one down. Now, mitochondrial support, you can do CoQ10 chewables. In this case, I chose a powder that is watermelon flavored that I mixed in pomegranate juice, or had them mix in pomegranate juice. And it's a hit or miss depending on the morning, but it is generally being accepted. And into that, you can mix your scoop of glycine or your half scoop of glycine, because glycine, it doesn't dissolve beautifully, but it is a fairly low flavor, sugar-like crystalline powder. So glycine is usually a hit with kids. It's really good at calming the nervous system and protecting the liver, helping with liver detox. We did a fish oil in an emulsified form, and then magnesium glycinate liquid, as well as citrate chewables. We did that same chewable B vitamin, which is, again, hit or miss depending on the day, and then a chewable broad spectrum antimicrobial formula, which is surprising me and is, sometimes I'll use a liquid. This time we used a chewable that I really liked, and it is going down easy for both kids. And so this is a child that I do not have a retest on. He, in addition to being resistant in food eliminations and supplements, he is resistant to donating stool for samples and giving blood. So it's a challenge. And so still waiting on that, but also I would have run either the pathogen panel or the full GI map in this case. And then we're going to skip that. I've got some co-regulation exercises that I love. That's for a whole different topic. So in summary, use lab testing to personalize your tests. You can get way better results clinically in your more symptomatic patients if you use labs to find out what's out of balance. You want to choose your supplements really, really carefully in this population. Some kids will be more compliant than others. And then I want you to normalize anxiety. So when people come to you with anxiety, it's not always a negative thing. It is a positive emotion. It can feel stressful. When it gets into that area of affecting life, leading to physical symptoms, then that's a problem. And that's when we want to look deeper into physiology and lab testing and really not stop until we find something that can help our patients. And with the tests I discussed today, you can really help your patients. And then co-manage and refer out. So I almost always refer out my kids with anxiety to a counselor, to an art therapist, to OTs. And then call in and consult with us. So that's all I want to say there. You can learn more with me. I have a lot of DSL education out there. We have the resource library for our practitioners, and I also have a private practice. And I just wanted to thank you again for taking time out of your busy day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rolfson, and we wish everybody have a great rest of their afternoon.